I think we see addiction just from a general perspective. I think everybody would agree that there's some component of self-regulation to that. But I think some people also see it as once a person gets on a substance or a behavior in terms of addiction, whether it's food, whether it's a substance, that it's kind of, in a sense, out of their control. Is it just self-regulation that's the issue in an addiction?
Addiction is very complicated, and we could be talking about drug addiction, sugar addiction, sex addiction. I mean, all kinds of addictions out there. So it's complicated. Think of it as a big puzzle piece. Self-regulation, definitely a component of that. What other things you want to be aware of? Trauma, childhood, fractured attachment patterns do increase the risk of addiction later on in life. But if you work with people with drug and alcohol problems, a very high percentage of them have fractured attachment patterns.
Welcome to the Managing Mental Health podcast. Join us as we talk to leading psychologists about all areas of mental health, and we hear from real people that have overcome real experiences with mental health struggles who can now share hope and healing and encouragement for us all. I'm Jamie, social psychologist, author, and trauma recovery coach. Welcome to part 5. This is our special 6-part series on executive functioning. If you're just now joining us, be sure to check back with the previous episodes where we talked about what executive functioning is, what it's responsible for, some important clinical and forensic considerations, some of the things that cause executive dysfunction. And we also learned about implications for physical health, and we talked about a little bit about the neuroscience behind it all. So today we're back with our very special guest, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Welcome back, Dr. Brown.
Jamie, thank you for having me back, my friend.
Thank you for joining us. Today's topic, I think, is probably one of the more underrated areas of executive functioning, which is self-regulation. I think it's probably something that we kind of take for granted, and maybe we don't think about enough in terms of how it just helps us in our lives if you have good executive functioning, and the converse of that being that how harmful it could be if you have dysfunction. So what exactly do we mean by self-regulation, and how would that connect to executive functioning?
Yeah, so there's many dimensions of self-regulation. So you have that emotional component. So if someone just flies off the handle emotionally, like anger control problems, that's a component. You got the behavioral component as well, which is kind of interconnected with emotions, but behavioral, controlling body movements. Are you disruptive in the classroom? There's attentional components to this. So are you someone, when someone talks to you, do you kind of drift off and stop, and you have a hard time to stay focused? That's attentional self-regulation. So those are some of the dimensions. That there's a multitude of concepts that fall under this umbrella. There's physiological regulation. So when someone gets really afraid or worked up, and you have that physiological feeling in your body, like your heart rate starts going up and your hands start clenching, you get hot or cold, that's physiological regulation. There's something called effortful control. That would be something I would mark down on the list if anyone wants to really get deep in the weeds with this. And I talk about that sometimes when I talk about criminality and executive dysfunction. Plays a lot of role too in addiction treatment. So effortful control, kind of a component of inhibition, impulse control. Self-control, self-regulation, as far as I'm concerned, they're pretty much the same thing. You're going to find some authors in the literature that maybe break them apart just a little bit, but in my opinion, they're virtually the same thing. We've talked about inhibition quite a bit, our brain's internal parking brake. That is pretty much a component of this. So when you have good inhibition, the parking brake in your brain tells you, well, it's probably not a good idea to have that 4th plate of food at the buffet, or, I have to get up early and go to work. So it's probably not a good idea that I stay up till 2, 3 in the morning and watch a movie. Those are just when inhibition can kick in. Executive ability, again, those kind of higher order cognitive processes we've talked about throughout this series. There's all kinds of other things. Reflective functioning is talked about a little bit under this umbrella. If anyone's interested in like attachment theory and early childhood development and parenting approaches, really learn about reflective functioning. I think that's a part of it. We've all heard about grit. We know like grit, hanging in there when things get tough. People with good levels of grit don't throw in the towel when things don't go their way. Maybe if have the thought of quitting your dissertation, which I did a million times because it's hard, it's not fun, but grit keeps you going. Grit is a component of self-regulation. Mentalization is another term you'd want to be aware of that does partially relate to this. I talk about mentalization when I give talks on theory of mind. Theory of mind relates to perspective taking, understanding the internal mental states of other people. We spoke about that a little bit during part 1, I believe. But when you study theory of mind, you'd also want to understand mentalization. And again, we learned earlier on in this series too that executive function plays a role in multiple other domains of functioning. We talked about theory of mind, emotional regulation, which is a component of what we're talking about today, social competence, consciousness, moral development, and school readiness, to name a few. Jamie, I'll park the brakes, see if you got any thoughts before I go a little deeper in the weeds.
Yeah, and thank you for that overview, because it just goes to show exactly what I was thinking when we started. This is probably one of those areas that's a bit underrated in terms of our thinking on why we do the things we do, why some other people don't act, behave the same way, because there's so much more to this. Especially, I love the theory of mind, and we may have to do an episode later at some point just on that. I guess one of my first questions that came to mind and during that was the idea of addiction. I think we see addiction, just from a general perspective, as more of like, I think everybody would agree that there's some component of self-regulation to that. But I think some people also see it as like, once a person gets on a substance or a behavior in terms of addiction, whether it's food, whether it's a substance, that it's kind of, in a sense, out of their control, or maybe it just starts bad and goes worse. And so what would be maybe a balancing point, or is there one, between, is it just self-regulation that's the issue in an addiction, or is it the chemical change in the body?
Addiction is very complicated, and we could be talking about drug addiction, sugar addiction, sex addiction. I mean, all kinds of addictions out there. So it's complicated. Think of it as a big puzzle piece. Self-regulation, definitely a component of that. If you look at the literature on that, what other things you want to be aware of? Well, trauma comes up a lot. Was there a lot of early childhood trauma, or even in utero trauma? Fractured attachment patterns play into addiction. There's plenty of research that shows childhood fractured attachment patterns do increase the risk of addiction later on in life. Not everyone with a fractured attachment pattern is going to grow up and have a drug and alcohol problem. But if you work with people with drug and alcohol problems, a very high percentage of them have fractured attachment patterns. I do a lot of work in the area of like integrative health and wellness, lifestyle medicine. So looking at it through kind of a functional integrative lens, there is research literature that also points to the fact, if you're working with folks with addictive tendencies, you'd probably do well learning about blood sugar dysregulation, inflammation, oxidative stress, the gut microbiome, food insecurity, sleep issues, circadian rhythm misalignment, poor family modeling, understanding it from a neuroscience standpoint. Plenty of research says look to the striatum, look to executive function, a little bit on the limbic system, the amygdala. So I throw all that out at all of you. It's complicated. You just can't say, hey, it's self-regulation problems. Yes, that's a part of it, but think of all those other things. And there's many, many more that I shared as well, or I didn't share, that we need to consider. And I think if addiction programs started to infuse all these things into the good work they're doing, and maybe some are, but at the very least, if you're infused trauma-informed care, attachment-based approaches, executive function, and really put a premium on helping that client eat better, exercise, get better sleep, I think it would lead to better outcomes in terms of helping that client stay sober longer.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so important because, like you said, it's multifaceted. It's not just one issue, and the um, the failure rate is so high for
Huge.
people even trying to, combat addiction, because it's, if you're the one struggling with the addiction, you're probably not thinking of all those other aspects. You're just thinking, well, if I can quit this substance or if I can quit this action, then that's going to break the addiction. And that's just not true. It's, I mean, probably an extremely, extremely small percentage, um, because you've got all the emotional components, the cognitive components. There is one field of addiction treatment, and I don't honestly know if it has a title, but it's the approach of replacement. In other words, it's not just, okay, quit drinking. It's, you have to stop A and replace it with B, C, D, E, and F, which are all healthy things. And so it involves exercise, diet. So it's a very holistic approach, but it's sort of that, and I don't know if it comes from a viewpoint like you're talking about of all the different considerations, but that's kind of what that approach does is, and it's not, and it's very intentional about, okay, we're going to help you stop this by filling your cup with
Yeah.
other things.
I've
It's
seen it
work
play
for
out like that. I mean, those things are good, but I can think of a few cases I've been involved with where the client did replace the addiction with exercise and then started developing addictive tendency to exercise where they took
Mm,
it to the extreme, and that caused problems too because
uh,
over exercising is not good. I've seen some people replace their addiction and pick up food or sugar or screen time habits. Or there's one case I consulted on paper it looks great, but I really think the client became addicted to going to meetings and getting service providers where
mm,
they worked with everybody they could find under the sun. They had numerous sponsors. They volunteered constantly. They went to meetings constantly. That sounds good, but they did that to the extreme where then it neglected other aspects of their life. So we need to be
mhm.
aware, having that balance, even if it's a good thing,
Yeah,
doing too much of that good thing can be a bad thing.
yeah. The actual services provided and the people that were doing that became their relationship foundation. And that's I think out of all the things that, we've talked about in terms of trauma and mental health issues and even executive functioning, is the relationship part, I think, can be one of the most challenging,
Yeah.
but it also is one of the most vital when any type of growth and healing, you because we're relational people, as children, we rely on our parents. There's an emotional bond. There's the attachment theory, you mentioned that, that's affected. And then, as we grow up, we're in society, we have friends and family, and then you get into relationships. So that's always, 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 no matter where no matter where we're starting from, or what issue we're talking about, is that's the relationship part's always going to be critical.
Huge, huge. And genetics is a factor,
Mm,
and prenatal programming. You can look at some of that literature, what happens in utero as well. And so many things to consider, even before the person was born, that
mm,
could play a role in future addictive tendencies, such as prenatal food insecurity,
Hmm.
prenatal malnutrition. There's some literature on that may impact brain development and then place that person at greater risk of addictive tendencies as they get older.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good consideration too, is the prenatal care and how that affects.
Huge.
Um, so, you touched a little bit on the forensic or the criminal justice part of it, but throughout all of this part, especially, I can see it really, really having an impact on the educational component and those that are, the education professionals. What are some things that, if they're, you know, teachers, administrators, counselors, what are some considerations that they can think about in terms of executive functioning and self-regulation?
Higher levels of self-regulation oftentimes trickle down into that child being more ready to start school, starting kindergarten and K through 12 and so on. Higher levels of self-regulation are linked with academic self-achievement, without a doubt. Growing up, when I was in high school, I didn't do well. I probably lacked self-regulation amongst a million other things, bored, didn't turn in homework on time. College, different story. These things can change
Hmm.
if you work on them. It's not like we can't do anything about them. Maybe you have a child, there's a lot of trauma. Maybe that child's exposed to drugs and alcohol in utero. Maybe they have a diagnosis of ADHD or conduct disorder, oppositional defiant, or autism, or whatever it is. You work with kids with those diagnoses, they're probably going to be dealing with some level of self-regulation. And if you have children that have some of those backgrounds, diagnoses, life circumstances, sitting in a classroom for 45 minutes to an hour listening to a lecture is
Mhm.
going to be very, very tricky. These kids a lot of times need more movement, more stimulation, more exercise. So hands-on kinds of things can be very, very helpful. I really have thought about this a lot over the years. What would happen if all schools in the country and world started out the first class with exercise, with yoga, or just something,
Mhm.
get the brain going? Because if you follow the research too on childhood sleep issues, we know sleep issues are very common. We know a lot of kids are food insecure, so they come to school hungry, or they come to school and they've eaten really terrible food. That in and of itself can cause self-regulation issues. So looking at sleep, looking at diet, looking at exercise, just the common sense things we know that work,
Mhm.
looking at the schedule at the schools, I think that would play a huge role. How often is that taken into account? It doesn't seem like a lot. And on the flip side of that, poor self-regulation trickles down into a lot of times higher levels of obesity, poor eating habits, criminality in some cases, drug use, substance misuse, higher rates of unemployment as that person gets older. And it's not, again, just the self-regulation. There's other things here too.
Mhm.
I think I gave, this is a couple years ago, I gave like a, I don't even know, 10-part series to a university on self-regulation. And in there, I don't remember where it came from, but there were studies that indicated that around 40% of all deaths every year are linked back to self-regulation deficits on some level. So that really stuck with me.
Mm.
And think about it, of course, because think of road rage, think of overdosing, think of people that have chronic health conditions and they still eat terrible food and all those things. So
Mhm.
again, a million other layers here to take into account, but self-regulation, having good self-regulation is a protective factor. And you'll find other research too that says people with high self-regulation more likely to go to their dentist, more likely to use sunscreen to take care of their skin health, more likely to exercise, more likely to get better sleep. I mean, there's a million studies that look at this.
Mm. Okay. Um, So then what would you say, let's say maybe a couple of things that parents could do to help teach self-regulation, and then maybe one or two things that you think are important for adults that are trying to improve self-regulation.
One practical thing for anybody, any of us, go on YouTube and just type in the marshmallow test. Have you ever heard of that?
No, what's the marshmallow test?
Well, it's an experiment that's been done over the years. It's a cute experiment where they bring a kid into the room, there's a camera there, and basically say to the child, here are two marshmallows, and you put two marshmallows out in front of the child and say, if you hold off on eating one of these marshmallows for a little while, we'll give you a second marshmallow, so you'll have two marshmallows. And they basically have followed these kids over many years, and they found out that the children who eat that marshmallow right away and don't delay gratification, a lot of those kids may grow up and have more issues throughout life. It's not as simple
Mm,
as that, but it's a cute little thing for parents to be reminded of. So the
okay.
marshmallow test would be something just to take a look at. I think it's important for caregivers and professionals to really be aware that self-regulation is linked with the development of language, mathematics, reading skills, social behavior, and physical health. So it's very important to understand the interconnective there. And there's a lot of building blocks of self-regulation. Obviously, they really start in utero, in my opinion. But when we think about what parents need to be aware of, what are those building blocks of the house of self-regulation that we need to be aware of and help children build on? Well, attention and concentration, really teaching kids and modeling appropriate attention, redirection, trying to avoid that multitasking, behavioral and emotional development, executive function, planning and organization, receptive language, sensory processing, social skill development, and working memory are kind of the big building blocks of self-regulation as that child gets older.
Hmm.
On the flip side of that, there's a multitude of factors that can erode self-regulation. Prenatal and postnatal trauma, any kind of neglect and abuse. Maybe the child's not being abused, but there's a lot of caregiver unresponsiveness where the parents checked out. Maybe they're just burnt out. Maybe they're on their phone all the time and texting, and the child saying, Mom, Dad, Mom, play with me. And the parents just checked out. Those are things that can actually erode self-regulation. Even inconsistent caregiving practices can erode self-regulation. Developmental disabilities, brain injuries, untreated mental health, substance use issues, those are all things that can really get in the way of developing good self-regulation.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah. So that's a lot to think about. A lot to think about, and that's a really good tie back into your point on grit or resilience. Uh, Most everything that I've read and studied and worked with uh, is the things that you mentioned in teaching children delayed gratification, teaching them problem solving, teaching them relational issues. All that goes into building resilience so that later on in life, when something does happen, they recover quicker. They have a better sense of processing the emotions that come with it, whether it be, some type of accident or death or other trauma, anything like that. So yeah, all these things work together to build that executive functioning and that balancing skill. Okay.
And Jamie, the nice thing is with self-regulation, again, want people to really walk away that it can be taught, it can be improved, even if the child grew up and had some issues. Teaching these things to adults can be very helpful. And how do we do that? Experiences. If we do things over and over again and introduce that person to positive experiences
Mm-hmm.
that promote self-regulation, that's a good thing. Instructions, providing that person with concrete instructions on how to improve this, because some of these individuals, you may say it to them, but their brains don't process it. Show them, teach them, model it,
Mm-hmm.
coach it, and know that we have to practice this too. You have to do it over and over and over again. And think of neuroplasticity that we talked about. That ties into this perfectly. Neuroplasticity and self-regulation, all that go hand in hand.
I was just thinking that when you were talking about the repetitive behavior and practices to build stronger self-regulation, that's that neuroplasticity, and which studies more so now are showing that that there's proof, that, man, if you, especially as people get into later life ages and the senior ages, those that, if they just stop thinking, they stop reading, they stop doing any kind of activity that's constructive mentally, it affects their physical health a lot. And so this is the opposite of that, is continue to do, puzzles, reading, some kind of hobby, social activities, volunteering, all those things is going to help that neuroplasticity to continue to, have a positive impact, especially on their health.
Huge.
So, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. This is remarkable. Love it. Great, important topic. So I know a lot of people get a lot out of it. And for our audience, join us next time for part 6 of this 6-part series on executive functioning, when we'll discuss healthy lifestyle practices and lifestyle medicine. And you can find a list of each episode in the description. As always, please subscribe, like, and comment to share and stay connected to this community of mental well-being as we all learn and grow together. Thanks again, Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, everyone.